Wait, let me do accept the recording. Okay. So, yes. So we'll start now officially our Apcu forum for today. So, Apcu President Jeffrey Nang, Apcu Vice Chairman Sixto Benedicto, Apcu members and officials, to our distinguished resource speakers, to our media friends, to our local and foreign friends and colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Apcu Forum with APPCU Laureates with the theme U.S. Indo-Pacific Strategy under Biden, Implications on Philippines-China Relations. My name is Ana Malindo. I will serve as the moderator of this forum. As we all know, the United States has long been the leading power in the Asia-Pacific region since the end of World War II. The United States formalized its position through a series of treaty relationships with South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, Australia, and New Zealand. The U.S. security relationship with these countries have deepened because of the extent of U.S. historical and economic and cultural ties with these countries. Nevertheless, the rise of China as a contending power and as an economic powerhouse in Asia and beyond has somewhat challenged the U.S. It provoked and triggered the U.S. to initiate steps to attenuate and heighten the strategic importance of the Indo-Pacific region, or otherwise known as the Asia-Pacific region, to U.S. military and economic interests. Thus, this led to the Obama administration's pivot to Asia foreign policy, which laid the groundwork for the U.S. strategic rebalance in Asia and the Pacific by strengthening traditional alliances as well as pre-existing trade and economic ties with its partner like the Philippines. The Trump administration has pursued this pivot to Asia policy of the Obama administration, but coined it as the Indo-Pacific strategy, similarly looking at China's geopolitical rise as somewhat a direct threat to U.S. leadership and strategic interest in the region. The Biden administration carried the Indo-Pacific strategy and policy of his predecessors to a greater extent. On this note, our resource speakers for today's forum will shed light on the Biden's administration continued focus on the Indo-Pacific region and the implications of the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy on Philippine-China relations. So ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our forum for this afternoon. So to kickstart our forum, may I call on the Treasurer of Apcu, General Fernando Pase, for the invocation. General Pase.
Thank you and good afternoon, Ma'am Ana and the officers of Apcu, our distinguished speakers, and also those who are with us in this forum. Let us put our heads and place ourselves in the presence of God. Almighty and loving Father, Creator of heaven and earth, we praise you and adore you. You are our King, the King of Kings. We humbly ask forgiveness for our sins. Have mercy on us, O Lord. We are gathered here today for our Apcu forum for the month of October. Send us your Holy Spirit and be our guide and give us the wisdom to understand every topic that will be discussed by our distinguished resource speakers, which were among the top 10 Apcu laureates for the year 2021. Enlighten us, enlighten our minds, and let your love be upon us. May this forum, like the previous fora we had in previous months, bring success and growth to all of us. We thank you, Father, for this precious time that you have given us. All this we pray through our Lord Jesus Christ, your Son, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God forever. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sir General Pasek. So the next part of our program is the opening remarks. May I call on Apcu Vice Chairman Sixto Benedicto to deliver the opening remarks on behalf of our Chairman, Secretary Raul Lambino. Secretary Lambino can be with us today because of some pressing matters. So it's our Vice Chairperson, Chairman Sixto Benedicto, who will deliver the opening remarks. Sir Noy?
Thank you, Anna. Good afternoon, fellow guests and fellow board members and members of Apcu. Allow me to read the opening remarks of our Chairman, Secretary Raul Lambino. First of all, let me welcome you all to another Apcu forum on a topic that is of the highest relevance to our region in our time. 5 weeks ago, a newly minted security partnership known by its acronym AUKUS was announced in Washington by US President Joseph Biden just 8 months into his term. It is a three-nation agreement between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States called the AUKUS, Enhanced Trilateral Security Partnership. And already its first major move has sent shockwaves around the globe, in the words of a Manila newspaper columnist. This is the sale by the US of nuclear-powered submarine to Australia. These submarines, it should be noted, are among the most prized and highly secret high-tech weapon system in the world, as only 6 countries have the technological know-how and capability to build them. Even more, the American propulsion technology, according to a Financial Times report, is, and I quote, one of the crown jewels of the American military because it allows submarines to be stealthy when submerged and helps evade sonar detection. Now, why would this sale be so significant as to send shockwaves around the world? The answer is part speculative. Not only does it mean the transfer of this high-tech weapons system to Australia, more significant is that this American initiative under President Biden is said to have achieved, in the eyes of most experts, a strategic American objective. And that is, the US has positioned its weapon system near China without having to travel the thousands of miles to its home port to refuel and restock supplies. In plain language, as one local expert writes, the new tripartite alliance is obviously the latest US initiative to contain China's rise as a superpower in Asia. This dovetails with the view of Harvard professor Stephen Walt about AUKUS as a US response to growing perceptions of a rising Chinese threat, provoked by Chinese aim in the South China Sea and increased Chinese military capacity. The impact of AUKUS on countries in the South China Sea basin, especially on the Philippines, which is a friend of China, is yet to fully come out, but the initial anxieties it has spawned are a cause for concern. One is that AUKUS may be harming the interests of third parties in the region, meaning member countries of the ASEAN. The other and more deeply felt fear is about an emerging new Cold War type arms race centered in the South China Sea. As the Global Times, which reflects the official Chinese view, has warned, the new security agreement is, and I quote, likely to bring about a regional arms race and even a nuclear arms race. Now that we are living under the shadow of AUKUS, some urgent questions need to be tackled. Could AUKUS be harmful to countries in the Indo-Pacific region? Would it disturb the dynamics within ASEAN? Is AUKUS damaging to the currently warm relations between the Philippines and China? Our forum today is indeed highly interesting and relevant. On hand to join us are 2 foreign policy experts who need no further introduction because they are 2 of Apcu's 2021 laureates. Let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Rommel Banlaoi, President of the Philippine Association for Chinese Studies, an attorney, and Dr. Mario Leonardo Emilio O. Aportadera, who is a professor on international law. Thank you. That's all.
Thank you. Thank you, Sir Noy, for that very extensive opening remarks. Before we introduce our first speaker, let me quickly mention our forum's guideline. This guideline will ensure the efficient conduct of this forum. First is all participants will be muted except for the speakers and the moderator. The second is participants may type their questions and comments via the Zoom chat box. Please state your name and your organization. And the last one is those interested to have copies of the resource speakers' presentations, kindly signify your interest via the Zoom chat box and provide the Apcu Secretariat with your name and email address. Apcu will provide or send the materials after the forum. Friends, thank you for your attention. Now to introduce our first speaker, let me call on Raven to play for us a short audiovisual presentation as a way of introducing our first speaker. Raven, are you ready?
Dr. Rommel C. Banlaoi is a professorial lecturer at the Department of International Studies at Miriam College and currently an adjunct research professor at the National Institute for South China Sea Studies. He is the president of the Philippine Association for Chinese Studies, or PACS, and a board member of the China Southeast Asia Research Center on the South China Sea, or CSARC. As part of his deep involvement in promoting Philippines-China relations, he offers lectures and talks in various fields and has authored more than 70 publications in high-impact journals, among which delved into peace education and the promotion of the Philippines-China relationship. These include the ASEAN Regional Forum, the South China Sea Disputes, and the Functionalist Option 2001, Southeast Asian Perspectives on the Rise of China, Regional Security After 9/11 2003, Defense and Military Cooperation between Philippines and China, Broadening Bilateral Ties in the Post-9/11 Era 2007, Southeast Asian Regionalism and China's Soft Power Strategy in a Global Age 2010, Philippines-China Security Relations, Current Issues and Emerging Concerns 2012, Functional Cooperation and Joint Development, A Way Ahead in the South China Sea 2014, The Philippines, Security Options and Policy Implications 2017, Duterte Presidency, Shift in Philippines-China Relations 2017, Philippines-China Relations, Geopolitics, Economics, and Counterterrorism 2019, Benefits and Costs and the Philippines Paradigm Shift to China 2020, and Bilateral Consultative Mechanism in the South China Sea and Philippines-China Relations 2021. His recent publication, entitled Philippines-China Relations at 45 during the COVID-19 pandemic, New Discoveries, Recent Developments, and Continuing Concerns, exhibits a compendium of scholarly works across different disciplines commemorating Philippines-China relations at 45 amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Banlaoi is well sought and always being interviewed by various media outlets, especially on issues concerning the South China Sea and Philippine-China bilateral relations. He has been promoting the two countries' continued mutual understanding, friendship, and bilateral relations for 3 decades already.
Thank you, Raven. Without further ado, friends, join me in welcoming our first resource speakers, Dr. Rommel C. Banlaoi. Dr. Banlaoi, you have the floor po.
Thank you very much, Anna, for the introduction, and to Raven for the video introduction. I would like to thank Apcu again for the opportunity to speak in your event, and especially Dr. Jeffrey Nang and Attorney Lambino. And I'm also honored to be speaking with my fellow laureate, Attorney Aportadera. So good afternoon to all. I would like to share something. It will not take too long. Can you see now my slide? Okay, so what I would like to discuss for the next 15 minutes is to describe Biden's Indo-Pacific strategy in the context of what I call the U.S. hot peace with China and its implications for Philippines-China relations. And I have decided to discuss this topic because of many analysts and even scholars arguing that the growing competition between the United States and China will lead the world towards a new Cold War. And for me, that is in fact an overreaction to the current relationship between the United States and China. And for me, the best way to understand the current competition between China and the United States is the condition of hot peace rather than a new Cold War. And what will be its implications for Philippines-China relations? So what are the salient features of Biden's Indo-Pacific strategy? Well, there's one concept that will describe the whole Biden's Indo-Pacific strategy, and that is global re-engagement. And that is a reaction against Donald Trump's isolationist tendency. And this global re-engagement policy is based on the assumption that the fate of the United States is inextricably linked to the events beyond its shores. And even in the interim national security strategic guidance, where Biden articulated his Indo-Pacific strategy, he said that we will strengthen and stand beyond our allies, and that includes the Philippines, work with like-minded partners around the world, and pool our collective strength to advance shared interests and deter common threats. And what are these common threats? I will discuss that later. And according to this interim national security strategic guidance of Biden, he says that we face a world of rising nationalism, and this rising nationalism is fueling what he calls authoritarian tendencies in the world, and that leads to the receding democracy and also growing rivalry with China, Russia, and other authoritarian states, and a technological revolution that is reshaping every aspect of our lives. And this technological revolution is pertaining largely to the rise of cyber technology that can be used as an important tool to dominate the whole world. And that is, in fact, putting the whole world in the cybersecurity situation. And then in this Indo-Pacific strategy, Biden is reaffirming the need to promote what he calls democratic peace theory. Democratic peace theory states that we need to promote democracy around the world in order to maintain peace, because no democratic countries can wage war against each other. And if democratic countries decide to wage war, they will wage war against non-democratic states and not against democratic states. And the main purpose of war is a just war in order to defend democracy. And according to this strategy, especially in this strategic guidance, he says that together we will demonstrate not only that democracies can still deliver for our people, but that democracy is essential to meeting the challenges of our time. So in this strategy, Biden is reaffirming the need to reassert the democratic peace theory. And also, Biden's Indo-Pacific strategy is reasserting what we call American exceptionalism, which is akin also to Donald Trump's concept of America will be great again. And in this guidance, Biden says that the crisis we face are daunting, but America is not undaunted. And throughout our history, Americans have turned periods of crisis into times of renewal and opportunity. The same is true today. We have a chance not just to build back, but to build back better. By leaning into our strengths, we will shape a better future. What does it mean? It means that the United States is ready to shape the world again according to its image, according to the principles of democracy. So what are the current threats in global distribution of power according to Biden's Indo-Pacific strategy? Biden identified 4 major threats to global distribution of power. And number 1 is China, and next is Russia, second is Iran, third is Iran, and then North Korea. These are all threats to the democratic system. These are all authoritarian states that will threaten the interests of America to the whole world. And then in the context of these threats, Biden identifies the following national security priorities of the United States government. First is, of course, the protection of the American people. Second, expanding economic prosperity and opportunities through democratic means. And lastly, defending democracies and the American way of life. So Biden says that the American way of life is good for the whole world, and that American way of life is in fact grounded on democratic principle. So what are the national security action plans of Biden under his leadership? So he enumerates the following action plans. First, reinvigorate and modernize our alliances and partnerships around the world, and that includes the San Francisco system of alliances in Asia, that includes the Philippines, South Korea, Japan, Australia, and even Thailand, and also in the context of our current developments, the formation of Quad, and even the formation of AUKUS. And second, regaining U.S. leadership in international institutions because of the observation that Donald Trump moved backward to fulfill U.S. leadership in international institutions. And Biden wants to regain this U.S. leadership because the U.S. says that the U.S. is the leader of the free world. And lastly, responsible use of U.S. military while elevating diplomacy as a tool of first resort. So these are all the national security plans of the Biden administration. Now, with this kind of strategy, is the world leading to a new Cold War, especially between the United States and China? For me, it's not a Cold War. It's an overreaction and quite overblown. While there is an ideological divide between the US and China, in my observation, the world is not yet divided along ideological lines the way we experienced during the Cold War between the United States and former USSR. In fact, the world continues to balance its relations between the US and China. So that's the main difference between the Cold War and the current situation. Second, the US and China are not yet engaged in actual military conflicts fought in different regions, and we call it the proxy wars, the way the US and the former USSR did during the Cold War. In fact, there's still no military parity between the two powers. Still, the United States is far more advanced in military power than China. Though China's military power is, there's no doubt, growing, the US at present continues to be the world's dominant military power. So my third argument is that while the Biden administration has declared China as a global competitor, the US has not yet declared a war against China the way the US declared a war against the former USSR during the Cold War. And there are many indications that China and the United States want to sustain the peace that we currently enjoy, especially in the aftermath of the Second World War. And my last point is that though the US and China have fundamental differences on many global security issues, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region that divide the two major powers like the Taiwan Straits, the South China Sea, the Korean Peninsula, and others, the world wants the two major powers to work peacefully together in order to fight threats that the whole world shares, like the global pandemic, international terrorism, transnational crimes, climate change, environmental degradation, world poverty, natural disasters, and others. So, is the world leading to a Cold War? The world cannot afford a Cold War the second. That's my argument. Why? Because the Cold War between the US and USSR brought human miseries and sufferings. We learned from the outcomes and consequences of the Cold War. It's full of misery and also costly. The Cold War between the US and USSR was costly, not only for the United States and for the former Soviet Union, but also very costly to the whole world. And this is just an example of the study that calculated the costs and consequences of the Cold War, and we don't want to repeat this kind of costs and consequences again. We have suffered the consequences of the Korean War, of the Vietnam War, and the Cold War in Africa, and recently, because of the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, the Soviet-Afghan War in the 80s, the Cold War in the Arab world, and even the Cold War in Latin America. It was very expensive, costly, and disastrous for all these key regions of the world. So there is now a global clamor for the United States not to pursue Cold War with China. Okay, so I invite you to watch the YouTube presentation here of international conference that was held in Latin America. And the main focus of the discussion is that a new Cold War against China is against the interest of the humanity. And there are a lot of bright ideas articulated during this international conference that also inform my current arguments in this presentation. So the world is not leading to a Cold War because of US-China competition. What I see now is what Michael McFaul calls hot peace. It's not a Cold War, but hot peace. Hot peace is a political situation where tensions between countries are real, but these tensions are unlikely to lead to actual armed confrontation. Okay? And the world, under the condition of hot peace, has moved on from the Cold War of the last century to the hot peace of the current one. And I will use Michael McFaul's concept of hot peace to describe the future direction of US-China relations. And even Biden's Indo-Pacific strategy says that the United States will lead with diplomacy and therefore will avoid conflict. We will renew our commitment to global development and international cooperation while also making smart investment in our national defense. So diplomacy is still the #1 priority of the United States, and making the use of force as the instrument of last resort, as enshrined, in fact, by the Charter of the United Nations. China, in fact, also seeks peace. Okay, and that is part of its national defense strategy. That China seeks peace, but is able to go to war. But China seeks no trouble, but is not scared of trouble. So the priority of China is to promote peace, although preparing also for war. But the main intention is to maintain the current peace that we all enjoy. And even President Xi Jinping, during his speech last year at the UN General Assembly, he reaffirmed that China has no intentions to fight a war with any major powers, more so with the United States. And he promotes, in fact, the concept of a harmonious world, that despite all our differences, we can still build a community of shared future by accepting each other's differences. And this is China's concept of harmonious world under the leadership of President Xi Jinping. And in this concept, China is always a builder of world peace and a contributor to global development. So that's the intention of China. And just this September, in his speech at the UN General Assembly, President Xi Jinping reiterated his interest to promote peace and development for the whole people of the world, despite our different paths to modernization. So that's it. And this is a good thing. This is a positive thing that is happening. Biden and Xi Jinping decided to hold a virtual summit before the end of this year in order to discuss their differences and find a common ground in order to maintain international peace and security. And for me, this is a very important confidence building measures and an important event for preventive diplomacy in order to save the world from possible armed conflict. Okay. So, but unfortunately, under the condition of hot peace, we are now seeing two contending peace models. Pax Americana, which is American way to peace, which aims to promote peace by strengthening the power of the free world. And at the same time, we are seeing another peace model being promoted by China. We call it the Pax Sinica, or Chinese way to peace, which is promoting harmonious world and a shared future for the whole humanity. And these two contending peace models are in fact causing the situation of hot peace. So Biden wants to be the leader of the free world, and also as a leader of the free world, I hope we will escape what Thucydides would call the Thucydides trap, because you know, the Peloponnesian War occurred because of this Thucydides trap. And in this Thucydides trap was based on the observation that it was the rise of Athens, and in the current situation is China, and the fear that is instilled in Sparta and in our case, the current case is the United States, that made war inevitable. So can we escape the Thucydides trap? That begs the question. But based on data, based on observable, measurable data, there is now a projection made by Goldman Sachs that China will overtake America in 30 years and even earlier because of its current post-pandemic recovery and the current situation in the United States, that China will overtake America maybe in less than 30 years because of the current trend. And if you will look at the projection made by the World Bank, it says that China is surpassing the US economically. I mean, US is falling economically. So will this lead to the trap? And in case of foreign currency reserve, US not even in the top 10. And the number one in terms of foreign currency reserve is China, with a staggering amount of 3.1 billion US dollars, only followed by Japan of 1.2 billion US dollars. And China has become number one in terms of purchasing power parity, surpassing the United States in just a few decades. Okay? And China is leading the world in terms of global infrastructures and development. Just look at the map being financed by Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and also being financed under China's Belt and Road Initiative. And China is leading in that aspect. And when it comes to speed train, China is in fact leading in infrastructure development. However, US and China continue to have competition in order to reassert their world economic leadership. And these are the areas where China dominates and the area where the United States dominates. So the world is divided economically, but not yet militarily, as we saw it during the Cold War between the US and the USSR. And if you will look at the sphere of influences of these two major powers, China's sphere of influence is very strong in North Korea, South China Sea, mainland Southeast Asia, and Pakistan, and now to include Afghanistan and other parts of Central Asia and even South Asia. And the US sphere of influence continues to be within the United States concept of San Francisco system, particularly with South Korea, Japan, Oceania, which includes Australia and even New Zealand. And here we can see the role of AUKUS in that one. And some neutral countries are maritime Southeast Asia, including the Philippines, but we are not really neutral because of our alliance with the United States. But we remain to be friendly with China and other countries in South Asia. So that's the condition. But right now, China is laying the foundation in Eurasia for Pax Sinica, and also Pax Sinica in the Middle East, and Pax Sinica in Europe. So before we have the saying that all roads lead to Rome, but now we see that all roads lead to China. So this is the Pax Sinica that is threatening the peace model of the United States, which is Pax Americana. So what will be the implication of this situation for Philippines-China relations under the conditions of hot peace? For me, we need to continue to play the hedging preventive diplomacy in the major power game. What do I mean by this? I mean that we need to sustain our friendship with China because of economic and many other pragmatic considerations, and not only because China is our close neighbor. Okay? We need to sustain this friendship with China because we cannot afford to have an adversarial relationship with China, but at the same time, reinventing our security alliance with the United States under the current situation, especially in the post-Duterte period. We need to do that. And this is my last slide. This is my conclusion on how the Philippines can survive in the condition of hot peace, especially in the context of US-China competition. And here, there is a liberal option, or the option espoused by liberal theory of international relations, which is in fact continue to be friendly to all and enemy to none, which is in fact Duterte's concept of independent foreign policy. But there's also a realist option stating that no friends, no permanent enemies, only permanent interests. So if we decide to choose between the two major powers, it's not because it's dictated by China or it's dictated by the United States. It is dictated by our own national interest. And there's also a constructivist option. We make your friends, we make your enemies, okay, depending on how you construct them. because being friends and being enemies are all socially constructed. It's all a product of experiences and socialization. So we need to balance our relationship between the two major powers. However, there are risks in doing so because on the part of the United States can question our loyalty to the alliance. But on the part of China, they will question our sincerity as a friend. But that is in fact the risk we need to take in order to survive in a condition of hot peace as we see the growing competition between the United States and China. And I think that's all. And let me conclude with some of the quotes I got from the internet, that war does not determine who is right. It only determines who is left. So by Bertrand Russell. And then war is delightful to those who have had no experience of it. That by Desiderius Erasmus. And according to Marcus Cicero, one of the great Roman emperors, an unjust peace is better than a just war. And then the Thucydides trap, according to Thucydides trap, it was the rise of Athens in the fear that this inspired in Sparta that made war inevitable. But Xi Jinping stressed that we all need to work together to avoid that Thucydides trap. It's not only the responsibility of China or the United States to avoid the Thucydides trap. We need to work together, okay, to avoid the Thucydides trap. Destructive tensions between an emerging power, which is China, and an established powers, which is the United States. Thank you very much for your attention. And I look forward to meaningful conversations during the open forum. Thank you. Good afternoon to all.
Thank you, Dr. Banlaoi, for that extensive, informative, and thought-provoking presentation. I think just to give a little bit of summary, or synopsis of what Dr. Banlaoi have shared with us, I think there are three important points that I want to reiterate. First is that there is a general trajectory that the United States foreign policy under a Joe Biden presidency aims to reinvigorate and modernize its alliances and partnership around the world. So that's one. And it seems that the US wants to promote and strengthen its so-called democratic alliances under the Indo-Pacific strategy as a common and unified front against countries like they consider non-democratic like China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and the like. The US also considers its strategic security alliances and partnership with countries in the Indo-Pacific region like the Philippines as, I think, very vital in their national interest. Also, Dr. Banlaoi explained extensively about if there's a new Cold War or there's none. As for him, he thinks that there's none at the moment. And also I think one of the most important point that for the Philippines is what you call the significance, according to Dr. Banlaoi, of the preventive diplomacy and the calibrated balancing act on the part of the Philippines amid the ongoing geopolitical competition between China and the US in the Indo-Pacific region. So ladies and gentlemen, we will have more discussion on all this in the open forum, and you will have chances to ask Dr. Banlaoi as well. You can again write your questions and comment in the chat box. So moving forward, to introduce our second resource speaker, let me call on Raven again to play a short audiovisual presentation as a way again of introducing our second speaker for today's forum. Raven?
Dr. Attorney Mario Leonardo Emilio O. Aportadera is currently a faculty member of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences of the University of San Agustin, Iloilo. As a physician, he teaches BS Biology courses such as Human Anatomy and Parasitology, and as a lawyer, he teaches pre-law courses such as International Law, Political Theories, and Introduction to Law. He served as an editor-in-chief of the Augustinian Mirror magazine and was a delegate in the Japan International Cooperation Agency's Friendship Program for the 21st century from May to June 1986. He joined the Manila Doctors Hospital for his postgraduate internship and served as president of the MDH Postgraduate Interns Organization. Because of his deep love and devotion for learning, he also took his Bachelor of Laws degree from the University of San Agustin, Iloilo, and served as editor-in-chief of the Augustinian Law Gazette. He is both a practitioner of general medicine and general law in Iloilo. In his article published in 2016 entitled "Balance Sheets Do Not Define Friendship," he discussed how the mainstream media biasly reported on the economic and trade relations of the two countries, the Philippines and China. He also wrote articles related to the issues of the South China Sea, explaining the intricacies of the issue while urging Filipinos and Chinese to have an open mind in dealing with a complicated issue like the South China Sea dispute. Dr. and attorney Aportadera also came up with a publication entitled "Mama Had a Knack for Storytelling" in 2017, where he shared and imparted the stories of his mother on how the Chinese think, being himself born to a Chinese mother and a Filipino father. His effort as an individual in promoting and advancing Philippines-China relations at the grassroots level is evident in his sensible observation and enunciated retort against anti-China and biased media reporting.
Thank you, Raven, for that audiovisual presentation. Now, ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Attorney and Dr. Mario Leonardo Emilio Aportadera. Sir, the floor is yours po. Raven, kindly assist Attorney Aportadera with his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon to all. I was tasked to talk about the U.S. Indo-Pacific IPS under Biden and its implications on Philippine-China relationship. More on the subsection of the rule-based order and the issue of freedom of navigation. Indo-Pacific is a geographical term over a pan-geographic region, a confluence of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, as former Foreign Minister Abe of Japan called it, to connote the state's spheres of economic, political, and cultural influence extending beyond the individual state borders. It is also an umbrella term that encompasses Indo-Pacific specific strategies of countries with similar interests in the region. The concept has been developed to Japan, Abe, and American cooperation, especially during the time of Obama in 2007. So next slide, please. IPS is a work in progress through 3 U.S. administration, 8 years of Obama, 4 years of Trump, and now under Biden. It is officially called the East Asia Strategy, or the Pivot, more commonly known as the Pivot to Asia. It was a significant shift in foreign policy of the United States, which original focus was events in the Middle East and Europe to East Asia. Next slide, please. Hillary Clinton, in her November 11 America's Pacific Century, published in Foreign Policy, states there are 6 courses in action of the Indo-Pacific strategy. But number 1 is the strengthening of security alliances. Since then, more than 4 years after the Obama administration, we have seen Quad and the AUKUS being formulated and being practiced. There is now, you can see the deepening, number 2, the deepening ties with rising powers, which may refer to India. Regional multilateral institutions, as Professor Banlaoi earlier mentioned, America is now trying to reach out to countries, particularly in the ASEAN. In fact, the present defense minister, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo met with members of ASEAN countries, leaders of ASEAN countries, to propose an ASEAN NATO. Expanding trade, we all know that. Military presence. There are even reports that of the presence of military personnel, of U.S. military personnel in Taiwan at this time of heightened tension in democratic and human rights causes, which is perhaps the course of action that will sanitize whatever they have plans on this IPS. Next slide, please. So the reactions have been varied. Aaron Friedberg called it more on the hype, and we found one thing in substance. The World Pensions Council saw that it was more, the IPS is more as a strategy to contain China and not even to promote world peace. And Michael Pavey, the power of pivot will be boosted by American arms. President Hu Jintao stated as a reaction to this IPS of America that the United States has been strengthening its military deployments in the Asia Pacific. It strengthened its US-Japan military alliances, strengthened strategic cooperation with India, Quad, improved relations with Vietnam, established pro-American in Afghanistan, eventually only to lose to Taliban again, and now the increased arms sales to Taiwan. They have extended outposts and placed pressure points on China from east, south, and west. Russia is to the north. So it resulted in the former Chinese state councilor Dai Dingguo, who suggested to Hillary Clinton over this pivot to China and said, why don't you, the US, pivot out of here, of Asia? Next slide, please. Under the Trump administration, he basically renamed it as a free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. Professor Banlaoi mentioned about the hot peace, but the hot peace, but Biden would eventually call this as the competitive existence. Shinzo Abe, former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, called the Indo-Pacific as a confluence of the Indian and Pacific Ocean in his speech to a rising power, which is India, at the Indian Parliament. Of course, Quad was re-established during the term of Biden, and he renamed the U.S. Asia Pacific Command to the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command on May 30, 2018. This is not just a changing of terminologies. In fact, under the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, the radar system of the American has been transferred somewhere in Arizona to Hawaii, so that it will take only U.S. personnel 5 minutes to detect incoming missiles, say, allegedly from China, on the way to U.S. mainland, while under the NORAD, NORAD, it would take 20 minutes for them to detect incoming missiles. Next slide, please. So this is the competitive coexistence between U.S. and China. And of course, under Biden, it will be more of a broad continuity of the previous two administrations. And he has always emphasized that Indo-Pacific has become the front and center in terms of diplomacy for the U.S. And just less than 2 months ago, we have heard about the AUKUS. No, it's also, for me personally, it's more hype, and it found something, found one thing in substance. Next slide, please. Okay. I was tasked to discuss the IPS based on the rule-based order. And what is really the rule-based order? It is a set of norms and principles on global security and economic governance. It is about peaceful, predictable, cooperative behavior among states that is consistent with liberal values and principles. I underscore liberal because it is subject to vague definitions and conflicting definitions. And number 3, it is the role of powerful democratic states to help and preserve the system. Next slide, please. So, role-based order protect the sovereignty, preserve the peace, and curb excessive use of power and enable international trade and investment. Next slide, please. So it is more than just military strategies. Rule-based order is also um, connected with international standards related to health and pandemics, to transport, telecommunication, and other issues that underpin the global economy. Next slide, please. And norms that underpin universal human rights, gender equality, and the rule of law. So this particular slide, you can see the trust under the rule-based order of protection for discrimination against person based on sexual orientation, emphasizes the shared community responsibility in combating homophobia and transphobia. So this is not all about military personnel. Next slide, please. The Australian 2016 Defense White Paper called this rule-based order as a shared commitment by all countries to conduct their activities in accordance with agreed norms, agreed rules with time, such as international law and regional security arrangements. I underscore regional security arrangement because of the recent development over the AUKUS, which is a trilateral multi-pronged alliance between the UK, the US, and Australia. Next slide, please. The origins of the rule-based order is by the victorious allies at the end of World War II. It's caused the establishment of formal institutions like the UN and military alliances, NATO, SHATO. It also resulted in unprecedented peace, prosperity, and freedom. God forbid, at least we have not experienced a global war since then, since the end of World War II. Along this line, the rule-based international law is also referred as the UN-centered system that imposes limits on what states can do and which provides a wide array of rules governing international economic relationships. It has become a forum, in fact, the most authoritative forum for interstate behaviors and arguments over to discuss and settle their issues and disputes. Next slide, please. Okay. Much as they want to portray that China is trying to undermine rule-based order, international law, it is not of public knowledge that China was the first state signatory of the United Nations Charter, the San Francisco Charter. In the picture, you will note it is a UN photo. Ting Piwo, a delegate from China, signed for China the charter as the first state signatory. China was followed by the then Soviet Union, and after that the three best Western powers. But why China was tasked? Why China was honored to be the first state signatory? Because the victorious Allied powers recognized that it was China that first and perhaps the most, but first suffered from the invasion of an Axis power, which was Japan, the Rome and Berlin Axis power, when it was invaded as early as 1936 by Japan. Next slide, please. So, on state security, we see formal alliances, not necessarily AUKUS alone. So we have the Organization of Islamic Conference. We have the non-aligned movement. So that it allows a forum for discussion and collective measures. Protection of state sovereignty and territorial integrity, limit the use of military force, and limit the spread of weapons of mass destruction. Next slide, please. We have seen on world economy, we have the promotion of interconnected global economy based on free markets, open trade and finance, sub-regional tariff-free regions or areas of commerce. Next slide, please. in governments, the advancement of democratic values and human rights. Next slide, please. There are several problems, however, inherent problems over this rule-based international order. We have to go back to its origins. The rule-based order were based on dominant values and cultures of countries from the North Atlantic, Great Britain, the United States, and even perhaps with white Anglo-Saxon Protestant background. So it is anchored on number one, that the prevailing order in the world is on the primacy of the United States, having emerged as the superpower after World War II. They've always believed that democracy is the way of the future. But we have seen several times the failure of nation building along democratic principles, the Arab Spring debacle, the retreat from Afghanistan. It wants to arrive at a global consensus about problems. There never has been and never will be anything approximating universal agreement on genuinely collective policy approach. Nation states do not act on the basis of goodwill or good intentions. They act on the basis of defending their national interests. The increasing multipolar world of alliances and new pluralistic world has given rise to what New York Times columnist David Brooks called global sclerosis, an inability to solve problem after problem. While they want to project Western unity, Western European unity, it is not a natural construct, but more of an highly artificial one. There is no end to nationalism. They were thinking that with a national body, like the United Nations, sub-regional alliances, liberal states will delegate substantial power to international institutions to comprise liberal international order, but only resulted in popular backlash. No international institution should make policies that have profound effect in the member states. We have seen about Brexit, and we even saw the success of Donald Trump in 2016 over his America First and populist policies, which enabled him to win over Hillary Clinton. They were thinking that under a rule-based order, cooperation among rival states will emerge. But we have seen that Beijing or Moscow does not want U.S. military force in what they see as a sphere of influence. We have seen how China protested about reports of the presence of American troops in Taiwan during this heightened period of tension. And of course, they were basing it on the U.S. unipolarity. The U.S. has fought several wars since the Cold War. The Gulf War, twice, in Bosnia, in Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, as the effect of the Arab Spring policy, which is literally every three out of the 4 years since the Cold War that they have been at war and have not understood other societies and people. Next slide, please. Okay. So my second topic will be on the freedom of navigation. The freedom of navigation is a more or less recent subset of international law on maritime policies. It has many silent features, but its history started with the Consolato del Mare, or the customs of the sea, which were developed and employed in local jurisdictions, mostly in the Italian states along the Mediterranean, regarding the capture of high seas by pirates and privateers. Under the consolatory customs, enemy goods can be captured on neutral ships and neutral goods are free on board of enemy ship. This is under this framework, neutral shipping was not inviolable in times of war, but navies were free to attack ships of any nation on open seas on the belief that they may be carrying cargo for a belligerent state. However, goods belonging to neutral states, neutral countries on those ships, even if they were enemy ships, were not to be taken. This developed into the Marie Clausum, which states that states could limit or even close off seas or maritime areas to access by any or foreign ships, just as areas of the land can be owned by the states, limiting foreign activities. So among the salient features of the freedom of navigation through the centuries is that the flag of any sovereign state shall not suffer interference from any other state except as provided by international law. Freedom of movements for vessels, freedom to enter ports and to make use of plants and docks, to load and unload goods and to transport goods and passengers. Next slide, please. This basically is codified, stated in Article 87, Paragraph 1 of the 1982 UNCLOS. The U.S. is not a signatory, but enforces the practice through its Freedom of Navigation Operations, or FONOPS. In this Freedom of Navigation, it incorporated Mare Liberum, free seas, the free ship, summarizes as free ship makes free goods. Neutrals and a shift from the old practice wherein neutral ships were fair game in times of war. This time, neutral ships are off limit for attack in the high seas. Next slide, please. The UNCLOS. So you will note that there is a trade-off between the Marie Clausum, wherein states can impose sovereignty over the bodies of water, and Mare Liberum, which encourages navigation of free passages through bodies of water. It upholds freedom of navigation on high seas, but establishes different zones of sovereignty. Zones of sovereignty. That's the important part. That's the important term. Zones of sovereignty, which I will show in the future slides. The UNCLOS, or the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, is also called as the Law of the Sea Convention or the Law of Sea Treaty. It establishes the legal framework for all marine and maritime activities. As of June 2016, 167 countries plus member states of the European Union are parties to it. So the trade-off of Mare Clausum is that it asserts that the ocean, that advocates that the sea should be under the sovereignty of the state, whereas Mare Liberum asserts that the oceans to be open to all nations. Next slides, please. Okay. Basically, the freedom of navigation can be summed up in these phrases: right of innocent passage, right of transit passage, right of archipelagic sea lanes passage, and the freedom of the high seas. The right of innocent passage allows ships to travel in other countries' territorial seas, if it is not prejudicial to the peace, good order, and security of the coastal states. At the height of China's nine dust line territorial claims over the South China Sea, China now requires warship to attain prior authorization before they enter Chinese national waters, which they claim to be within that non-dust line policy. Transit passage refers to passage to states used for international navigation between one part of the high seas or an exclusive economic zone and another with more relaxed criteria for passage. However, the passage must be continuous and expeditious transit through the strait. The archipelagic sea lanes passage applies to countries comprising archipelagos like Indonesia and the Philippines. It provides for sea lanes and air routes passages through archipelagic state waters where ships can enjoy freedom of navigation. And now what is defined as the high seas? The high seas are open to all states, whether coastal or landlocked. Even the Article 87-1 of the UNCLOS gives freedoms that include freedom of navigation, freedom of overflight, the laying of submarine cables, building of artificial islands, fishing, and scientific research. Then I have two more slides ahead. Next slide, please. Basically, just for a reminder, so this is a picture of a territorial sea. It's 12 nautical miles of territorial, which will constitute territorial waters, wherein the coastal state exercises territorial jurisdiction and sovereignty. The extension of another 12 nautical miles from the border of the territorial waters constitute the contiguous zone. These contiguous zones can be defined as the belt which extends 12 nautical miles beyond the territorial sea limit. The state control, the coastal state control in this area is to limit and prevent actions which infringe in customs, fiscal, and immigration laws. Basically, you have seen what is happening in Europe with the wave and wave of migrants sailing in boats to enter the European community, Europe. It can also act in any activities that threaten regulations over jurisdiction in the territorial sea, like when vessels carry noxious, dangerous substance or waste may be turned away on public health and environmental grounds. The exclusive economic zone is defined as the belt of water which extend up to 200 nautical miles from the baseline of the coastal state. It includes the territorial sea, and the contiguous zone. Coastal state controls all economic resources such as fishing, mining, oil exploration, marine research, and has jurisdiction regarding the protection and preservation of natural resources and marine environment. This is precisely a contending point between China and the Philippines over the case brought before the UNCLOS. Because the Philippines claim, particularly like the Scarborough Shoal, which is an exclusive economic zone, which is a fiction brought about by the UNCLOS over what we say the trade-off of the Mare Clausum in the Mare Liberon, extending zones of sovereignty to a limited extent and definition. While China, with its 9 dust line policy, claims that the Scarborough Shoal is within the 9 dust line boundary that it considers as territorial waters. Now we go to the continental shelf, which is also a contentious matter because it is defined as an area whose outer limit should not exceed 150 nautical miles from the baseline, 350 nautical miles from the baseline, or shall not exceed 100 nautical miles from the exclusive economic zone. Why? Because the continental shelf under the UNCLOS, the coastal state has exclusive rights for exploring and exploiting natural resources, exclusive rights to authorize and regulate drilling on the shelf for all purposes. So, the continental shelf, it said that the Spratly Islands have a potential for oil exploration and sources. And beyond the exclusive economic zone are the high seas, They are the part of the sea that is not included in any exclusive economic zone in the territorial sea of any coastal state, in the internal water of any coastal state, or the archipelagic water of an archipelagic state. They are open to all states for freedom of navigation, freedom of flight, freedom to construct artificial islands, installation, etc. High seas are only reserved for peaceful navigation through international water. There are regulations to avoid prevention of slave trade, piracy, seizure of ships, illicit narcotic trafficking, and unauthorized broadcasting. So we have seen how in the Horn of Africa, how multilateral states cooperated together, at least in the fight against piracy. Next slide, please. Okay. The China non-dust line. This is a photo from the Economist. And if Economist, and you will see that basically the contentious islands of Scarborough, the contentious area of Scarborough Shoal, and it's within their claims, no area of claims. Now, as a backgrounder over the ITLOS ruling, there is one particular article which provides for an opt-out. An opt-out clause where contending parties will reject the jurisdiction of the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, so the ITLOS, on the grounds of maritime delimitation. That is precisely why China came out with a nine-dust line boundary. But is this a new invention? No, it goes back. It goes back to 1932 as history, and in the succeeding slides will tell. So who has more evidence, who have more legal standing over the area? Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay. The freedom of navigation operations, which I mentioned, which is along the line expounded by the U.S. to use military troops or the military might to challenge excessive maritime claims as defined by the U.S. Department of Defense. It emphasized that by the full notes, any member state can reinforce freedom of navigation by practice. So we have these several instances other than this freedom of navigation operations along the South China Sea. There were the several Gulf of Sidra in Libya incidents. If you can recall, Gaddafi drew a line around 52 nautical miles from the baseline of Libya to the sea and called it a line of death. So any vessels risk being shut down. And there were several incidents. Some American aircraft and Libyan aircrafts were shut down in their confrontation of them. But fortunately, nothing came out of that. And we all know about the USS Yorktown collision, wherein the American battleship, while being guided out of Soviet Union, then the Soviet Union territory, was accidentally bumped by a Soviet Union warship. Next slide, please. What is alarming is the U.S. SOCNOPS conducted in South China Sea the number of it is on the rise. There was one only 2015, 3 in 2016, which were during the last 2 years of the Obama administration. And you will note the consistent rise from 4 in 2017 to 9 in 2020 to coincide with the term of Donald Trump. Next slide, please. Okay. Basically, two notes operation is a very high risk gunboat diplomacy of the 21st century. We have a military defense treaty. We are signatories of several visiting forces agreement with several states, the US, Singapore, even Australia, which is now part of the AUKUS. And we have to remember that military aircrafts are considered under international law as extension of territories. Are we going to be drawn into war with these several and numerous FUNOPs being undertaken in the South China Sea? Now I go back to the nine dash line world boundary, which China is claiming as a basis for its opt-out clause in the ITLU's jurisdiction, which was drawn by Bao Mei-chu in 1932. He was a 20th century Chinese geographer who based the nine dash lines on boundary markings he discovered along several islands and rocks in the South China Sea. And from that, he gave this best quotation: building the nation is what learning geography is for. We all know that in international law, one element of a state is territory. Not necessarily as wide as the South China Sea, but territory is an element of statehood. And the next slide, which may refer to the earlier slides of Professor Banlaoi, next slide, please. This will be my last slide. Next slide, please. Okay. Ambrose Bierce, an American soldier and writer, war is God's way of teaching the Americans geography. So I have raised an alarm over incidents of possible sparks for confrontation between two superpowers, China and US. And you can see several, as illustrated by symbols, of punops along disputed islands, very near disputed islands being occupied by China. So you will see the black mark and the red pink markers that signify the occupied, the dangerous islands occupied. We all know from history that any warring nation will find an excuse to wage war. We have to go back to Cuba and the start of the Spanish-American War, which brought us to war by virtue of being a colony of Spain in 1896. The battle cry. Remember Maine. Maine was an American ship docked at the Havana harbor, which exploded in mines. And the battle cry was, remember the Maine, to instigate public uproar against Spain and lay down the justification for a war that made America a colonial power. From that war, America got Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. The Treaty of Paris set us from Spain to the United States. Decades later, after much investigation, the main incident was concluded as an accident and was not caused by Spanish mines at the Havana harbor. Now, what are the implications? The first implication is that we have a defense treaty. We do not want to be brought to war by fighting an enemy of the United States by virtue of that Mutual Defense Treaty in 1951. The second implication is that peacetime has brought us prosperity, peace. By 2020 figures, China is our largest trading partner at 61.15 billion US dollars. That's almost a third of $1 trillion in pesos. It is the largest source of imports. People may dismiss them as cheap products, but by virtue of China being the factory of the world, many lower middle class families were able to enjoy video game, microwave, ordinary things that were beyond their means had it been made out elsewhere other than China. China is also the third largest buyer of Philippine exports, and it is the second largest source of foreign investment. Like Professor Banlaoi, The best risk, however, instead of war, is to follow what he said towards the last part of his lecture. We rather be in the middling, middling agenda. Let them talk, let them, we just have our own Philippine policy for what is best for the Filipino people. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, sorry. Okay, thank you so much, Dr. And Attorney Aportadera, for that enlightening, extensive, and equally educational presentation po. We have quite limited time, so we'll just proceed to the open forum, and then we'll be further discussing the points raised by both Attorney Aportadera and also Dr. Banlaoi. So, sir, there's a comment first from Mr. George C. and then his question. His comment is actually no unprecedented peace, just no world war. Actually, unprecedented number of random invasions and coups around the world instigated by Western powers. That's his comment. But the question of Mr. George C. is, does the U.S. accept foreign power, freedom of navigation operation along the U.S. coast and Central American waters? So that's his question. So any of you can actually respond to the question. Again, the question of Mr. George C. is, does the U.S. accept foreign power, freedom of navigation operation along the U.S. coast and in the Central American waters? Any one of you po can respond to the question po.
We are all aware that the United States is not a signatory of the UNCLOS, and one basis for the United Nations not to be bound by the code by the UNCLOS is the problem in the Gulf of Mexico, the overlapping claims of maritime territories with Mexico and the United States, from territorial waters, coastal, to even the exclusive economic zone. As to the answer of as to the question of, does the United States allow footnotes, I have not heard of any incident that any foreign military power has done a footnotes along American territorial waters in aid of freedom of navigation.
Any comment from Dr. Banlaoi, or we'll proceed to the next question po?
Let's proceed to the next question.
Yes, sir. Okay. Okay, thank you, Attorney Aportadera, for that answer. This is a question addressed to Professor Banlaoi. What is our national interest vis-a-vis the West Philippine Sea or the South China Sea, which islands, shoals, and reefs are now occupied by, of course, the People's Republic of China? So that's the question addressed to you, Professor Banlaoi.
Thank you very much for that question. Of course, our national interest is to see China vacating all those features that are in fact part of our maritime zone or part of our exclusive economic zone. But we have to understand that in the South China Sea, especially in the Spratlys, there are two major types of conflicts there. The territorial nature of the conflict, meaning who owns the land and the land features in the area, and the maritime issue, who has the right to exploit the resources on those areas. So when it comes to the territorial issue, of course, nations go to war to protect the territory, and China will not negotiate for release or surrender of that territory. Now, if we use that kind of argument, then really the nations will really go to war to defend their territory. But there's also another aspect where Philippines and China and other claimants can cooperate, and that is the maritime aspects. And I think China, when it comes to maritime jurisdictional issue, is willing to negotiate with neighbors, willing to cooperate with neighbors, and willing to promote joint development with neighbors. But of course, our national interest is to have our exclusive right to develop those resources. But under the current realities where there are claimants, I think the only pragmatic way to do that is to negotiate for a more pragmatic terms in order to promote cooperation and pursue the joint use of the resources in that area, especially not only for exploitation, but also for marine environmental protection and also protection of the fishermen in the area. So if we will pursue our gain in the International Arbitral Tribunal, the International Arbitral Tribunal is urging China to leave the area because it clearly belongs to us. And if you will look at the characteristic of those features occupied by China, these features are in fact mostly low tide elevation. Most of the time, these features are in fact submerged under the sea, especially during normal tide, more so during high tide, and therefore belonging clearly to the maritime zone of the Philippines, specialist concept of exclusive economic zone and continental shelf, as described earlier by Atty. Aportadera. But unfortunately, the issue is not only about the water, it's also about the land features. And China occupies the land features. We cannot forcibly evict China from those occupied features. We cannot. And even the United States cannot do that. Even Japan cannot do that. Japan is also having problem in Singapore. So what's the way ahead? The way ahead is to pursue cooperation, to jointly develop the area, and not only to jointly develop the area, but to jointly protect the area for the benefit of the whole humanity. And the humanity includes the Chinese, the Filipinos, the Vietnamese, the Malaysians, the Brunei's, and all other user states in the South China Sea. I think that's the way to go. And war is not the option. War is not the option. War will only destroy the coral reef, will only destroy the ecosystem of that area. And that's why I oppose AUKUS, because submarine operations in the South China Sea will just put a lot of environmental stress in the ecosystem of the South China Sea. Just imagine a lot of submarines operating under sea of the South China Sea. That's stressful for the marine environment of the South China Sea. Thank you.
Okay, sir. You will respond, Atty. Aportadera. Yes, sir. Okay, po.
I think Professor Banlaoi has answered the question, but I want to make some corrections in the line of questioning of that question. No, the question was, I have to make clear that the Spratly Group is a group of islands being claimed by several claimant states and being occupied by several claimant states. In fact, it is not only China, but also the Republic of China, Taiwan, has several islands under its control. Taiping Islands is still under the control of Taiwan, and Vietnam occupies several features there, while Malaysia is said to have the most number of features, rocks, islets under its occupation. So I just want to dispel this misconception that it is Philippines versus China. There are many claimant states there.
Okay, thank you very much for that response, Atty. Aportadera. I have a question here. Geopolitically, Southeast Asia is arguably the key battleground when you talk about the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. On this note, can you share with us your perspective as to the outlook, attitude, and how the 10 member states of the Association for Southeast Asian Nations, or the ASEAN, have perceived the possible long-term implication for the regional architecture that the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy will bring to the ASEAN region? So how the ASEAN countries look at this Indo-Pacific strategy, that's much more the question, I think. Yeah.
Well, if you will look at the position of ASEAN, there is a ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. And in that ASEAN outlook in the Indo-Pacific, ASEAN is stressing the centrality of ASEAN in managing security issues facing the region. Okay? And also calling all its members to strengthen ASEAN unity to handle all security issues facing the region, including the South China Sea. So that's the ASEAN outlook. So in charting the destiny of the Indo-Pacific, ASEAN says that it's not only the will of the United States that will prevail, it's not only the will of major powers, that ASEAN centrality has a say in shaping the future of the Indo-Pacific. And ASEAN says that it will contribute to the shaping of a peaceful and orderly region in the Indo-Pacific. So that's the outlook, and that's the outlook also that the Philippine government shares. And when it comes to the issue of the South China Sea, ASEAN wants demilitarization of the area that is consistent with the ASEAN Treaty on peace, prosperity, and friendship in the in Southeast Asia. You know, the concept of amity and peace in the area, and also the concept of what you call this, the freedom and neutrality, peace, freedom, and neutrality in Southeast Asia, as well as nuclear weapons free zone. So these are all the ASEAN frameworks that ASEAN uses in addressing the issues in the South China Sea. But of course, there's a problem of really implementing this ASEAN centrality. But right now, ASEAN is becoming increasingly involved in handling the security issues in the Indo-Pacific, and in the context of the South China Sea, is currently negotiating with China for the conclusion of the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea and strict implementation of the 2002 Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Banlaoi. Attorney Aportadera, would you respond to the question? Yes, sir.
Well, we may feel that the South China Sea being near the Philippines may be a center for possible conflict between overlapping interests. There is also a reason, but we have to realize that under the Indo-Pacific strategy of the United States, the mere fact of the change of name from Asia-Pacific to Indo-Pacific is because they have to include the Indian Ocean. Because along these sea lanes, 80% of Chinese goods, import and export, import in terms of oil, pass through this body of water. 90% of Japanese goods, import and export, pass through this body of waters. And it is also consistent with what Hillary Clinton pointed out as 6 courses of action. Which is number 2, the deepening ties of a rising power. India is now considered a rising power in world affairs, and it wants, the United States wants to combine and collaborate with India in trying to contain China. Now, as a bit of history, immediately after, not necessarily immediately after, but one of the effects of the Quad was Operation Malabar, where it's considered one of the largest maritime and naval exercises conducted by the navies of India, the United States, Japan, and South Korea. After a very much hyped and publicized large naval activities, exercises, Mike Pompeo had a conference with representatives from the ASEAN states hinting of a possible ASEAN NATO. So far, the response is not united, is not one. As we have seen over the development of AUKUS, where in several countries like Malaysia and another country express no satisfaction over the alliance, the trilateral alliance, when in fact our foreign minister was quoting balance of power in approving the AUKUS. One country like Malaysia canceled the state visit of a visiting dignitary from Australia over the issue of AUKUS. Thank you.
Thank you po. There's a question here about Malampaya. The question is Malampaya covered by the non-dash line? How we should treat this non-dash line? That's a question coming from Mr. Richard Magallanes po. Any one of you can actually respond to the question po. Is it covered by the non-dash line?
Well, the Malampaya is not covered by the non-dash line. That's why China did not interrupt the operation of Malampaya. But the Red Bank is covered by the non-dash line. And if you will base the argument on the decision of the International Arbitral Tribunal, according to the tribunal, China's non-dash line does not have basis under international law, and therefore China must not abandon the 9-dash line. But it is a unilateral action of China. It is same unilateral action when we declared PD 1776, declaring the Kalayaan Island Group. But the difference between this unilateral action is a PD, the presidential decree is based on existing provision of UNCLOS, especially asserting the archipelagic doctrine and our entitlements of our exclusive economic zone and entitlement of the continental shelf. But there are also problematic portions of the Kalayaan Island Group because, yung Pag-asa Island, which is the most developed island that we occupy, is outside our exclusive economic zone. In fact, 30% of the Kalayaan Island Group is in fact outside of our exclusive economic zone. Only 70% are clearly inside our exclusive economic zone, and we are still strengthening our argument to extend further our claim under the principle of extended continental shelf. But that's another legal battle. But the problem is the decision in the International Arbitral Tribunal is in fact challenging our claim in the Kalayaan Island Group, because there are technical aspects that the International Arbitral Tribunal did in defining the characteristic of the land features in the area, and that will significantly affect our claim over Kalayaan Island Group. So there are a lot of problematic areas, and from the scholarly standpoint, we need to really address all these problematic areas. But the 9-dash line is similar with Vietnam's concept of claim and our claim, and these are all unilateral actions. But if we will base it from the ongoing negotiation on the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea, the members of ASEAN is asserting that when we delimit the boundaries of the South China Sea, it must be based on existing international laws, particularly the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea. And that is why China, when it comes to the water aspects of the dispute, is willing, China is willing to talk, willing to negotiate, willing to explore possible ways of managing peacefully the disputes. But when it comes to the territorial aspect, that's another matter. Thank you.
Yes, po. The next question is a little bit related to the 2022 national elections, and I think the question is from Mr. Nelson Nang. The question is, who among the presidentiables that is running, who are running right now, you think can best handle all these issues related to the Indo-Pacific? I think the West Philippine Sea and all that. All those geopolitical issues that the Philippines is facing right now. So who among them, according Mr. Nelson Nang is asking, what do you think? Would you, I mean, you can answer this question or not, no? We can just, pass, because this is very, I think very political for now, and there's election upcoming. But there is another question here from Mr. Michael Alunan. Okay. Yeah, the question is, how do we see the U.S. handle the dilemma it is facing with China as it tiptoes cautiously on its tightrope geopolitical foreign policy? So that's the question of Mr. Alunan. Yeah. How do we see the U.S. handle, or how the U.S. is handling the dilemma it is facing with China as it tiptoes cautiously on its tightrope geopolitical foreign policy? So yeah, that's a question. Any one of you can answer. We'll go to Attorney Aportadera first, then to Professor Banlaoi. Yeah.
Ma'am, in relation to the earlier question, which I wanted to answer with a one sentence.
Okay po. Sige po.
Substitution clause, it's too premature to answer on the matter of the foreign policy on the South China Sea and West Philippine Sea. We still have to wait until November 15. Now, about the question was about dilemma, but I think it's more of strategy. But we will mention several pressing problems facing the United States today in the line of increasing Chinese assertiveness over its territory, its patrimony, its role in world affairs. We have several. There is, number one, a bitterly divided domestic political scene in the US. We all know what happened, what is happening. An assertive China, which is further emboldened by its quick recovery from the global pandemic, while the rest of the world still reels under its impact. For me, on this second matter, it would still be to our best interest that China recovers because, as I said, China is our largest trading partner. Number three, allies and partners fear the possible abandonment of the US in the light of the withdrawal or retreat from Kabul. And of course, something closer to our hearts, as nations in the Southeast Asia, we are afraid to be entrapped in the ever-increasing hostility of the Sino-Chinese Cold War, which Biden should address and has not so far come out with a conclusive assurance to its allies in Asia and around the world.
Yes, sir. Okay, thank you, Attorney Aportadera. So, Dr. Banlaoi will proceed to the next question, or you will respond to the question? We'll proceed. Okay. There's another question. There's another question coming from Mr. Severino Benedicto. He said that I just came from another meeting, and before the meeting started, one of the participants who is in Florida said that mainstream media is highlighting certain facts and hiding those that are not in their favor. How does this affect the information that we get vis-a-vis this specific topic, and what can be done? So it seems like it's all about mainstream media highlighting certain things but hiding certain things, and how it affects the issue of Indo-Pacific strategy and all these things, and what can be done, to address this some kind of a media is either hiding information or misinformation to that effect.
Well,
yes, Dr. Banlaoi.
Yeah, we are already doing what should be done, and that is to encourage more experts, academics, and specialists to discuss the issue. Because media is a tool for propaganda, but in a forum like this, we are providing a more informed and more nuanced understanding of the whole issue. So we need a more scholarly understanding of the issue, because other forces are in fact using fake news to promote a negative image of their adversaries. So this is the thing that we should do to encourage a more intelligent, scholarly, balanced, nuanced, and more circumspect analysis of the situation. And also even transcending our own popular nationalism. Because sometimes nationalism can even blind you from the realities that we need a collective effort to address the problem. So for me, while nationalism is important, we should also pay attention to regional interests, to regionalism, and also global interest, and that is globalism. So that's why our national interest must be defined not only by our own domestic interest, but also the interest of the region and the interest of the whole world.
Okay, I will read two last questions just to accommodate po kasi nagkaroon tayo ng extension. Then we will proceed to the last part of our program, which is the closing remark to be given by our president. Just to accommodate, because I'm looking at the time. So I will compress the two questions. The first one is still from Mr. Michael Alunan. How does we see, I think kanina na-answer na yung isa. The other one is how, on the one hand, this is the question, I'll just read it. How do we see the US handle the dilemma it is facing with China as it tiptoes cautiously on the tightrope geopolitical foreign policy, which was answered earlier? On the one hand, they depend on each other in trade investment, which China and the US, I think, which means they can't afford to go to war. But on the other hand, you have the deep state and the US military industrial complex, which survives on fueling more wars as they sell arms to all countries and groups on both sides of conflicts. The other one, the last question is from Cherry Generoso. Have you considered the recent move of the US in combating the further economic rise of China by forming the Quad and Quad 2, which greatly diminished the economic advance of China? So those are the last two questions that I will accommodate before we move on to the last part of our program. So both of you can answer the question. And yes, let's call on Attorney Aportadera first, then we'll go to the Dr. Banlaoi.
Quad and AUKUS are part and parcel of the Indo-Pacific strategy of America. of the United States. And it shows only one thing. It is an attempt to contain China economically, politically, in terms of influence among other neighboring states, and even militarily by depriving them of possible sea lanes during possible sea routes because China now has its first naval base outside of China, based in the Horn of Africa. So basically, it's an act of containing a particular country, China in this case.
Thank you, Attorney Aportadera. Yes, Dr. Banlaoi po.
Let me answer the question by mentioning two major theories of international relations. One is democratic peace theory. It says that promote democracy, and democracy will make the world more peaceful. So what the United States expects is for China to embrace democracy so that the world will be peaceful, because if China remains to be non-democratic, the democratic world will be threatened. But unfortunately, China is also championing its own brand of democracy. So that's the problem. So another theory is power transition theory. According to power transition theory, if the established power accepts the rise of another power, then the transition will be peaceful, and therefore that's good for the whole world because there will be a peaceful transition, the way we witness the transition of the United Kingdom and the United States. However, if the established power will not accept the rise of a certain power, then the transition might be violent. So that's why we have to wait and see whether the current transition process that we are witnessing right now will end up peacefully or will end up violently. It will depend on how the actions of the established power will take. It all boils down to the actions of the United States as an established power.
Thank you so much to our resource speakers for answering the question, and thank you to our participants for posting their question and their comments po. We don't have time. I extended already for a few minutes. So let's proceed to the next part of the program. But before I call on our president, I just have a quick announcement. The next Apcu Forum with APPCU Laureates will be on November 18. And that's a Thursday, same time, 3 to 4:30 p.m. with Professor Jamie Flor-Cruz and Madam Teresita Angsi. And the topic is very interesting as well. It's people-to-people ties, the role of Chinoys in promoting Philippine-China understanding and friendship. And I hope our friends will be joining us also next month. Now, let me call on our president, Apcu President Jeffrey Nam, for the closing remarks. Sir?
Fellow officers, trustees, and members of Apcu, to our two esteemed speakers, Dr. Rommel Banlaoi, Atty. Mario Aportadera, media partners, friends, colleagues, a pleasant afternoon to all. Geopolitically, Southeast Asia is a key battleground where the US Indo-Pacific strategy is being tested. Hence, ASEAN countries are indeed caught between China and the United States and the changing regional order brought about by the rise of modern China. On the one hand, ASEAN countries do not want to lose their share of the dividends brought about by China's economic development. But on the other hand, they also recognize the reality that they need the US to some extent to balance China in the region. In light of these regional geopolitical realities and developments, the Philippines can try to insulate itself from the strategic rivalry of China and the US. The country will be better off if it maintains equidistance between China and the US while pursuing and preserving its national strategic interests. While the US is the country's treaty ally, China, on the other hand, is now the country's #1 trading partner, #1 import source, #2 export market, and a major foreign investor. The ongoing vibrant economic ties between these two countries are a huge boost to the country's quest for a quick bounce back economically from the economic devastation caused by the pandemic. Putting a strain on the economic cooperation between the Philippines and China is not to the advantage of the Philippines. Nevertheless, maintaining a friendly and cordial relationship with the US is also important for the Philippines. Thus, amid the changing, volatile, and very dynamic geopolitical context and environment of the Indo-Pacific, countries in ASEAN, like the Philippines, should avoid taking a side between the US and China and rather should seek a balance between the two countries' strategic alignments and economic interests. Southeast Asian countries, like the Philippines, should keep ASEAN centrality vis-a-vis the US Indo-Pacific strategy. Countries in ASEAN, like the Philippines, should maintain an ASEAN Indo-Pacific outlook that emphasizes common interests, strike a middle ground amid conflicting interests, and seek greater value in win-win cooperation in maritime affairs, regional connectivity, pandemic response, mitigating climate change, and economic cooperation. ASEAN countries like the Philippines and ASEAN as a bloc should rather play the role of a broker of a stable balance of power, employing multilateral and bilateral mechanisms in pursuance of a more stable, secure, and peaceful Philippines and ASEAN region. On this note, on behalf of Appcu, once again, I would like to congratulate and extend my sincere gratitude to our two speakers, Dr. Banlaoi and Atty. Aportadera, for sharing their ideas, knowledge, and experience about this topic. Let me express as well my gratitude to all of you who have joined and participated in this Appcu forum with our two distinguished APPCU laureates. I hope you've all learned and gathered as much take-home value as I have on this most consequential, possibly catastrophic war and peace issue, to be digested and pondered upon the coming months and years. Indeed, your presence and dynamic participation have made this forum a fruitful and very informative endeavor. Again, thank you to each one of you. Let us all be a broker of peace, stability, and prosperity in our respective ways for the good of the country, the ASEAN region, and the world at large. A pleasant day to all of you, and see you in the next Appcu Forum on November 18, 2021 at the same time. Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Thank you, Sir Jeff, for that closing remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, we have extended a bit, but thank you so much for attending the forum. I hope that you've learned so much. I have learned so much from the forum, and I hope you've learned so much as well. And yes, see you again in our next Appcu forum. Have a great day. Stay safe and healthy, and thank you very much po. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you po.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you,
Thank you
Rommel.
po.
Thank you, Atty. Aportadera.